Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our quarterly webinar, where my colleagues and I will be discussing our latest research. As always, we have quite a packed agenda for today, and we're happy to see so many of you dialing in for this session. In the next 30 minutes, we will discuss some of our latest research we have published. We will have a deeper look into the advertising industry and the financially material impacts of promoting environmentally harmful products. We will also discuss the role of ecosystem services and answer the question of whether the exploitation of nature yields higher returns than nature conservation. And lastly, we will look at water risks within the apparel supply chain and share our latest data dashboard with you. Some very quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, please add them in the Q&A. We will try and pick up a few here and answer them in the chat, but in case we can't get back to you on the webinar, we will reply via email later on. And also to note that all the reports which will be discussed today will be shared with you at the end, so you don't have to search for it online. And lastly, we will be recording this webinar. Now, before we kick it off, I wanted to take a brief moment to introduce Planet Tracker to those of you who aren't familiar with our work. Planet Tracker is a sustainable finance think tank conducting research on nature-related risks and opportunities. We focus on the drivers of biodiversity loss, specifically land and sea use change, exploitation of natural resources, pollution, and climate change. We provide in-depth research reports on each of these topics, covering a range of industries and themes, as you can see on this slide here. We are a not-for-profit, so everything that we do is for the common good, and all our research is publicly available on our website and or on your usual financial data platforms. And with that being said, let's dive into the webinar. The first piece of research that we want to talk about today is our latest report on the advertising industry, in which we explore its impact on the environment and the financial risks associated with it. With me is my colleague Dominic Lyle, who is the lead author of the report. And Dom, I'll be handing it over to you now.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to look into what we think is a very pressing issue within the advertising industry, and that's the environmental impact of the clients of the major ad agencies. Our aim in publishing this report was to examine the extent to which advertising is supporting businesses with very high environmentally damaging footprints. We focused on the 6 big holding companies that you can see here, WPP, Omnicom, Publicis, IPG, Dentsu, and Havas, because that's where the investment in the industry is situated. And of those 6, all except Havas are publicly listed, Havas being privately owned. It became clear at once that advertising agencies claim very publicly to be environmentally aware and committed to transitioning away from carbon-intensive clients. But the reality is that they continue to support clients with high environmental footprints. Every one of the big 6 holding companies not only handles oil and gas clients. In total, some 293 individual agencies work for these clients, but when the opportunity arises to transition away from them, they repitch for the business. This has been happening very recently with IPG and Saudi Aramco, or Havas and Shell. So quite apart from the illogicality of saying one thing and doing quite the opposite, this association with environmentally harmful clients poses a potential reputational risk for agencies. Losing a large client for reputational reasons would be a serious issue, as ad agencies have a high percentage of intangible assets on their balance sheets, and some 40% on average, so they're vulnerable to potential write-downs, and write-offs would have serious implications for asset coverage and for net income. So agencies have public ESG commitments which are not supported by their clients' selection strategies. To demonstrate this, we analysed the GHG waste and water emissions of 39 companies, which were the largest by revenue in their respective sectors. And we focused on oil and gas, plastics, food and beverage, automotive, IT and textiles. The chart on the right of the screen shows just the GHG footprint attributable to the 6 holding companies from those 39 companies which we analysed. To put that into context, the combined GHG CO2 equivalent footprint of the 5 publicly listed advertising holding companies based on just those 39 companies in this report is 530 million tonnes per annum, which is larger than the GHG footprint of the UK, which was 427 million tonnes per annum in 2021. By linking the emissions of these companies back to the relevant advertising holding companies, we could rank the latter according to the performance of their clients. In the environmentally aware context of the present, that provides a powerful message for investors about reputational risk and, where relevant, about environmental degradation. And that should be of concern to the agencies because a very high concentration of investors, but the top 10 own 43% of the holding companies. So what can investors do? Well, our report lists a number of recommendations for investors, but the three key ones are the following. Firstly, demand clearer measurements of clients' environmental footprints. Fully understand what your investments are supporting. Secondly, question executive remuneration, which at the moment lacks any meaningful sustainability components, particularly external ones. Instead, it focuses heavily on financial performance. Change is needed to prioritize sustainability in compensation. And thirdly, recognize the financial implications for the agencies of client and employee dissatisfaction in terms of impact on their profitability. Reputational risk is important. So in conclusion, our analysis urges a reassessment of agencies' role in promoting environmentally responsible practices. And investors are, we think, in a very strong position to drive positive change and mitigate risks. Thanks for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Dom. In the report, it's mentioned that all 6 holding companies are members of Add Net Zero, which is a voluntary industry initiative whose members pledge to voluntarily reduce in-house greenhouse gas emissions. Do you think that's a sufficient commitment?
Well, thanks, Nicole. It's certainly true that 5 of the 6 holding companies have now set net zero goals. But these plans only account for emissions generated by their own business operations, such as employee travel, energy used to power office buildings, and the production of advertising campaigns. Add Net Zero's 5-step action plan does not ask members to consider the potential wider climate impacts of their work. One of them being, of course, the risk that producing campaigns that enhance the image of heavily polluting clients could deflect pressure to cut emissions. Purpose Disruptors, which is a well-known campaign group focused on the ad and PR industries, defines the carbon pollution associated with advertising generated uplift in sales of heavily polluting products and services like SUVs and air travel as advertised emissions. The concept has been recognized by the UN in their Race to Zero campaign and focuses on getting businesses and universities and cities and so on to eliminate their carbon emissions no later than 2050. To put that in context, a 2023 report by Dentsu estimated that the company's 2022 advertised emissions were 32 times the size of their own operational carbon footprint. So Add Net Zero is a good thing, but it is by no means the answer to this problem.
Thank you, Dom. Yes, it's a really important takeaway to take the advertised emissions into account. We're now going to move to our next topic, where my colleague Francois Monnier, the head of our ocean program, will talk us through the role of ecosystem services through a deep sea mining lens. Francois, great to have you here with us.
Thank you, Nicole, and hello, everyone. Yes, today I would like to talk about financial performance and nature dependency. We often hear that nature is exploited for the sake of financial returns. And so we wanted to investigate the link between nature exploitation and financial performance. So I'll tell you how we analyze this from a long-term macro perspective, and then give you a concrete example focused on mining. So we have quantified the dependency of each industry globally on ecosystem services based on the Anchor platform. So ecosystem services are the benefits we derive from nature, and there are 4 types of them. The simplest to understand are provisioning services, which are essentially direct physical inputs like groundwater, fish, timber, or fiber. When industries exploit nature, they typically rely on these physical inputs. On the other hand, you have three other types of other ecosystem services, and these are more intangible, but essential, like climate regulation, pollination, nutrient cycling, water purification, etc. So for each industry, we distinguished the dependency on direct physical inputs from that on other ecosystem services. We then looked at the long-term financial returns of these industries and built two indices. One in orange here is an index made of industries that rely a lot on provisioning services, but less so on other services, such as forest products, tobacco, textiles, paper, mining, construction materials, etc. And in green, an index made of industries that rely a lot on other ecosystem services, but not so much on provisioning ones. It includes, for instance, home building, chemicals, electrical equipment, engineering, etc. Based on total returns, sectors skewed to provisioning services lag behind sectors skewed to other ecosystem services, as you can see here. If you invested $100 in 1991 into sectors that exploit nature, you'd get $848 in 2022. Now, if you invested in sectors that rely predominantly on other ecosystem services, you would have generated a return 3 times higher. That's pretty impressive. And yet, when you look at valuation ratios rather than returns, the opposite is true. Industries that rely on nature exploitation are consistently valued at higher multiples than those that rely on nature remaining intact, even though they underperform over the long term. And we think that this is something that financial market participants should learn from. And indeed, learning from that inconsistency really is particularly crucial now, as the world might begin to exploit the deep seabed to extract minerals. Again, here, the narrative is damaging the ocean is a necessary thing to do, in particular to ensure financial returns. And yet we found that this narrative is wrong. Analyzing OPEX and CAPEX requirements for deep sea mining, we concluded that mining and processing nodules from international waters would generate a negative return on invested capital of -2% at current metal prices. For investors, that would mean $35 to $49 billion of corporate value destroyed in the deep sea mining sector only. And that is just for investors in deep sea mining companies. Deep sea mining company would also destroy corporate values at terrestrial mining companies or fishing companies, for a total that we estimate would be up to $132 billion. And that is even before mentioning the environmental damage it would cause. If you add a financial estimate of the habitat destruction caused by deep sea mining, you easily get at least $500 billion of value destruction, as you can see on this chart. This is because the area affected would be huge and the likelihood of recovery very low, as we detailed in previous work. And that's just another example of this performance versus valuation relationship that we talked about before for companies relying on exploiting nature, like in this case, deep sea mining. So what does that mean for investors? If we zoom out again, that means that characterizing the nature dependency of your investments is critical. Many of your investments rely on nature remaining intact. And also some of your investment might rely on exploiting nature. Comparing returns using the prism of nature dependency is not how financial markets typically operate, right? But it might allow you to avoid a long list of nature-related risks. And obviously, past performance is no guarantee of future results, but it's worth keeping in mind the severe long-term underperformance of sectors linked to nature exploitation. For deep sea mining specifically, it means simply that it's in the financial interest of investors to avoid value destruction and therefore to support a moratorium on deep sea mining. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francois. And a question that actually has come up a few times when we've been discussing this issue is that with the exception of carbon markets, the concept of ecosystem services has not really been embraced by financial markets. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I think it's true that the concept of ecosystem services has many flaws, let's be honest, right? It's anthropocentric, contributes to a commodification of nature, and also really segmenting nature into different boxes makes little sense because all of these services are interdependent, right? So we have to acknowledge that. But I think the key issue for financial markets is not that, it's the absence of monetization, right? For the huge majority of ecosystem services, there's no market. There's no market for pollination, for instance. But this reliance on markets, on the concept of market is problematic as well. I'll use again a deep sea example, because let's say if you value the deep sea using a market-based valuation only, you'll find that more than 90% of the value come from exploiting oil, exploiting mineral deposits, right? And that naturally leads you to exploit those and ignore the rest. Now, we have done the same valuation using an ecosystem service approach, and we found the exact opposite. At least 90%, 90, of the valuation of the deep sea comes from the absence of exploitation through other ecosystem services, right? And so if the natural capital that generates these services is destroyed before it can be monetized, then there will never be any monetization of that valuation, that's for sure.
Great, thank you very much, Francois. Very interesting. And with that, we're going to move to the last theme of the day. Richard Bielachowski, who is the head of our textiles program, is going to run us through our latest report on the underappreciated water risks in the apparel supply chain. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. Now, our recent work across 2 reports has been funded by the Accountability Accelerator from Global Commons Alliance and has had a focus on exposing the impact and dependencies on water of the textile industry and why this represents an important risk for both corporates and their investors. Now, to provide some context, water is a fundamental part of textile manufacture as a critical input for a number of stages of production. Now, for instance, natural fibres rely on water as they are grown. As an example, data from the International Cotton Advisory Committee suggests a kilo of cotton lint consumes around 8,000 litres of water as it's grown. Now, this dependence on water for textile production comes hand in hand with significant negative water impacts. Most straightforwardly is the consumption of the water, but there are also significant pollution impacts. For instance, the dyeing of fibres and garments is not only typically water intensive, but often uses highly toxic chemicals which can impact local water quality if dumped back into streams or rivers. Now, in our view, these dependencies and impacts make water a potential source of risk for the industry. The first of our reports, Exposing Water Risk, looked at how corporates and their investors talk about water as a risk. We used a proprietary natural language processing algorithm developed by Planet Tracker to examine corporate filings from 29 major apparel brands. Now, disappointingly, we found that many corporates barely mention water as a potential risk to their business. This is despite the fact that water stress is already high in many key sourcing regions for the textile industry. We also found that water very rarely comes up at investor events, suggesting it's not something investors are questioning management on, or at least not in public fora. Now, we find this lack of focus surprising. As mentioned, water is critical for textile manufacture. This means that it has the potential to materially impact sales and profits for brands if water-related disruption impacts their supply chain partners. As we discuss in our second report, Ripple Effects, and show in the table on this slide, we see a number of ways that water-related risk could impact a brand's P&L. This ranges from reduced sales because the supply chain is disrupted, meaning less stock is available, to a higher cost of goods sold because supply chain partners have to pay more to access water or to invest in water conservation measures. Now, alongside our second report, we've published a freely available interactive dashboard on our website to help investors think about the exposure of the industry and brands to water-related disruption. The dashboard focuses on current and future water stress in the textile supply chain. We show it here. The central chart shows a global map of the locations of textile factories overlaid onto water stress of different areas, and the map can be zoomed in or out as needed. On the right is factory location shown as a pie chart. On the left, we have some summary statistics. The charts at the bottom show the number of factories in different water stress categories. By using the drop downs at the top of the dashboard, we can zero in on particular brands or groups of brands. The first drop down allows you to look for a particular brand, the second to select a group of brands based on location of headquarters, and the third based on revenue. As an example of how to use the dashboard, if I go to the brand drop down and select Adidas, the charts and map update to show only data for Adidas. We can then see how their footprint stands today in terms of location and water stress, and what the forecast increase in water stress is to 2050 for their entire footprint. So, to conclude, what we believe investors should be doing differently in light of our analysis. Well, firstly, they should make sure they're discussing water impacts and dependencies with corporate management. Water could be a material risk to business, so management teams should be upfront on their exposure. Investors should push their holdings to transparently report their water impacts. This should include both their direct and indirect impacts. Like they do for greenhouse gas emissions, corporates should be moving towards reporting their scope 1, 2, and 3 of water impacts. With better data on water impacts and dependencies, investors should then support efforts by corporate management to develop and implement water transition plans to address their impacts and minimize their risk from water-related disruption. This could, for instance, involve setting science-based targets on fresh water. Finally, alongside the development of these plans, investors should ensure that they're backed by the capex needed and that management are appropriately incentivized to deliver them by tying some of their remuneration to their delivery. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Richard. The analysis very clearly shows the importance of water risk in the apparel industry. Given its importance, why isn't water risk already a big concern for corporates and investors?
That's a good question. I think that all too often water, like a lot of natural capital, is something we use and consume without thinking about it. We just expect it to be available at the turn of a tap. Similarly, for investors in apparel brands, water is out of sight and thus largely out of mind in terms of the major areas of impact and dependency. As I mentioned, the direct operations of most brands are unlikely to have a significant water footprint. Most of the impacts are felt or seen in the supply chain, and thus the risk from water-related disruption would appear to be minimal to their investments. What I think our work does is really make the point that water is not a hypothetical risk, and that addressing water impacts of the industry is key not only to its sustainability journey, but also de-risking the operations, and therefore is a positive for investors on a number of different bases.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. And for anyone who would like to dig deeper into the research we presented today, you will be able to find it on our website. You can simply scan the QR code on the screen and you will get to the webpage of the reports, where all other related content is also linked. So if you scan the water risk report, you will not only be guided to the report itself, but also the data dashboard and our interactive storyboard, which provides some additional information and a few case studies. And if you and your teams are working on these topics and would like to learn more, please reach out to myself. As part of our work, we offer deep dive sessions to investors on each of our reports and are happy to answer any questions. Now, before we wrap up this webinar, I briefly wanted to mention what else you can expect from us in the next few weeks. Just earlier this week, actually, we have released an overview over the status of green policies in the EU. As you will know, EU parliamentary elections will take place in June, so that's very soon. And European legislators are working on a range of regulations to finalize their adoption at the final Parliament plenary session this month, which range from nature restoration and anti-greenwashing requirements to waste and packaging and supply chain due diligence controls. So if you would like to learn more about the status of each of these regulations, have a look at this blog. And then later this week, we will also be publishing a report on plastics. It's a particularly interesting piece which examines the resin identification codes, a symbol which I'm sure many of you will have seen on the back of your food packaging, for example, and shows how the plastic industry has created the widespread impression that their products can or are being recycled, and therefore this is the solution to global plastic waste. And then lastly, we are releasing a new comparison report on climate transition plans of chemical companies. Some of you might have seen these reports already, but we have thus far analyzed 7 chemical companies and published individual reports on their progress on the matter. And we will now be releasing a report which will compare these 7 chemical companies on their climate transition plans and progress. The companies analyzed include Dow, BASF, Bayer, LyondellBasell, Toray, Incitec Pivot, and Air Liquide. And this brings us to the end of our update. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next update meeting at the end of Q2 in 2024. We wish you all a wonderful week and speak very soon. Goodbye.